Hello again and welcome to another Warhammer 40k Imperial Guard Tactics video, and today guys we are going to be talking about all things to do with deployment. Now I recently did a video called Everything You Need to Know About Screening, and if you haven't seen that one it's going to be linked at the end of this video, but it was a really popular video, so I thought I'd do another camera based video for you guys and hopefully it will be just as helpful as informative as the last one. So let's dive straight into this. What I've got in front of me today guys is a pretty standard Imperial Guard army. Now don't worry, this isn't deployed, it's just out here for display purposes at the moment, and what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at this list. I would call this a fairly standard guard army, and then what we're going to do is talk through the first things you want to be thinking about when it comes to deployment. You see, what's interesting is you should be thinking about deployment before you even start putting units on the table, because depending on what you're facing, depending on what you have, depending on what your opponent has, depending on what secondaries both sides are taken, it's going to make a big difference on how you deploy your army. So let's take a quick look at this list. I'm not going to go through any specific loadouts or anything like that. It's just to give you an idea of what a standard tournament guard army might include. So we've got 3 tanks there. We've got some indirect fire support as well. Got some scout sentinels for some screening, and then we've got some couple of big blocks of conscripts as well. Maybe some command squads, some mortars for more indirect fire, a few officers there as well, and then coming down the front we've got some infantry. So what you can see here guys is we've got about 5 main tanks, some support elements, and about 120 infantry, and that's a pretty standard guard army. Now before we start even thinking about where we're going to deploy and what's going to cover what, all this kind of stuff, the first thing you want to think about with screening is, well, Warhammer 40k has not random but alternating drops. So you put a unit down, then your opponent puts a unit down. One of the greatest strengths that the Imperial Guard has is that we have a lot of individual units. If you look at these infantry squads alone, we've got 6 units. We've then got 3 individual sentinels there. That's another 3 units. Now for some armies, that will be their entire army dropped down, especially if they're putting some things in reserve. Whereas for the Guard, that's not even anything important. You know, we've not even put any of our big hitters down yet. So what I like to do, one of my first tips and tricks for deployment that I want you guys to take away is, before you even decide what you're going to put down, don't just throw down your big things because you think, oh yeah, forget the cool ones down first. Just think, if I put down these units first, these ones I don't really care about, I can just sling them down the battlefield, put them in some cover, maybe have them a bit of a screen, put those out first, and then I can see where my opponent has put his heavy hitters. So that's the first tip that you want to bear in mind. Now you do also want to be careful that you don't put too much down, so then you block out where your heavy hitters can go. Worst thing you can do is put down everything but the heavy hitters, and then you find that you've not left enough room for them. So that'll all get covered in the visual aid in a moment, but I thought that's just a little tip and trick and a little warning that you want to be careful for. But now let's get this army out on the battlefield and see what it looks like deployed, and I can run you through why I've deployed certain things where. So here we have a pretty standard Warhammer 40k table. Not super competitive, not total planet bowling ball, just a nice normal table. We've got some ruins, we've got some loss blocking in the middle, and we've got a nice bit of terrain in each area. Now on a typical WTC style board or terrain heavy tournament board, you might be expected to see some like forests here and here, so those might be there, but for now we've just gone for some nice normal ruins. But if you think that you might be going to a really competitive tournament, you might expect to see some craters and some forests and some other dense terrain dotted around there as well. So as you can see, what you typically find with most deployment maps is that you're going to get, even if it's table quarters, or if it's Dawn of War style, or even if it's lengthways, what used to be called hammer and anvil, you're going to find that typically you're going to be given 2 to 3 pieces of ruins that are going to be in your deployment zone. So if you look over here, we've got a nice big bit of ruin here, we've got a ruin here, and we've even got some ruins here. Now if we then, that's in a table quarter style deployment zone. If we then look at this from a Dawn of War point of view, what have we got? Ruin, 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 and that's typically what you will expect to find in a tournament board. Now again, if we come over here and look at it from this perspective, what have we got? Ruin, ruin, ruin. We've got enough to hide a lot of our army behind. And then we look at this from our opponent's point of view, and let's have a look. Ruin, ruin, ruin. So typically, that's what you'll find in a competitive, more setup for a table. Now, to be clear, this isn't a perfect setup. I haven't got exact WTC terrain or even GW terrain. These are just my ruins that I've got. Now, but they are good enough for a rough approximation for what we're looking for today. So that's just to give you an overview of what you can expect. Now let's take a look at why it's important that a lot of tournament tables are set up in a similar fashion to this. The reason why it's so important to have terrain and have deployment zones which can have enough terrain in them is because Warhammer 40k is a very lethal game in 9th edition, and there's an old adage, no matter how well protected a target might be, if it's out in the open it's going to die, and that's very, very true in 9th edition 40k. So the reason why you find a lot of tournaments have this kind of setup is because they need to have it, otherwise someone's going to get turn 1 and they're just going to blow their opponent off the board. I have been to tournaments where they have not had enough terrain in the deployment zone, and I have seen game after game, including games of my own, that have literally been over turn 1 because one person just brought a really shooty army, they got turn 1 and they just blew their opponent off the table. It was absolutely brutal. So now that we've got these sort of ruins, you understand why they're there. How can we take advantage of the terrain that is in our deployment zone, and how can we be aware of the other terrain that is on the battlefield? So here we have some initial units that we've deployed on the table. Now I've deployed down here 6 infantry squads and 3 scout sentinels, and like we said, this is a really good example of me putting down units that are not of huge importance to me, but that if you think about that, I've deployed down a few units. Where are my heavy hitters? They're not on the field yet. Where are my command squads? Where are my officers? They're not on the field yet. But I've put down 9 drops. My opponent could easily have deployed the majority of his army in that case, and I've not deployed any heavy hitters. So I just wanted to make a little reference to that, what we were talking about before. But now we probably do want to put down some of our heavy hitters. Now, what we want to take advantage of is the fact that ruins are line of sight blocking terrain, and we want to hide our heavy hitters from getting picked up off the table really, really quickly. So typically what you'll find me doing is I'll put my manticores, my indirect fire units, those ones that do not care where they are because they can shoot anywhere. I'm going to put those down like in a little sort of pose like that. That's a very common thing you'll see a lot of guard players doing, and the reason you'll see that is because these manticores can happily shell anywhere on the table and it won't matter. They don't need line of sight, and guess what? It's going to be very, very difficult for the enemy to draw line of sight onto that, because, you know, if you think the ruin extends to here, the opponent's going to have to get an angle to there, but then this building's now in the way. So you can see it's really difficult for the opponent to draw angles on these guys here, because I've got my screening units out here at the front. We've talked about screening before, haven't we? So that's where I'd put my. That's where I typically put my my manticores, and then I'd be like, right, well, I want to get some tank commands down. Well, this one's got a demolisher cannon, so I want him to be protected, screened from enemy fire. So, you know, that's a pretty good angle there. Someone's going to find it tricky to get past that part of the ruin there. They're going to find it tricky to get past part of the ruin there. So that's a pretty good angle for him to go there. And then again, I've got another demolisher here. Now, I'll probably be like, you know what? I'll park that demolisher there. And then I'll park this battleclan. He's got a little bit more longer range firepower, so he's happy to go there. And then it's like, look, I've got my heavy hitters down, and all of them are pretty well protected on line of sight. All of them are pretty hard for my opponent to draw angles of fire on. You know, you can't get any of this, because imagine all of these ruins. I know you can see that there's windows here, but in a typical tournament board, guys, you cannot see through the bottom floor of any ruins. They are solid walls. So you can think all of these units are protected right now. No one can see through them. They're obscuring terrain, and it's really, really difficult for anyone to draw a line of sight on anything. Now I've deployed, look, I've not got that much left. A couple of squads of conscripts and a couple of support units. I've deployed well over 80% of my army here, and yet none of it is visible to my enemy turn 1. He's going to have to do some serious moving. He's going to have to be really, really maneuverable in order to draw line of sight on stuff, where I'm happily in a situation where I can, you know, move out with him, get a fire lane down there. If my opponent has done something similar and I can't see them, well, guess what? That's fine. I'll just take some objectives and I'll just start shelling in with my indirect fire units. So that's kind of an example of what you'd see of like the opening stages of a deployment. Let's get the rest of this army down on the battlefield here, and then talk about the different kinds of deployment you're going to want to employ against the different kinds of enemy that you're going to face. So here's the rest of the army deployed. I've got my command squads and other support elements tucked in around here, helping me get some secondaries like inflexible command and boots on the ground and all that kind of good stuff. I've got a block of conscripts hidden fairly well out of line of sight here. Maybe one or two of them will be able to get line of sight drawn to them, but the majority of them are pretty safe. And then we've got a unit of conscripts strung out the middle here. Now, this is what I would call a fairly standard deployment for me. This is where, you know, you're not sure exactly what you're facing. Maybe you've not faced it before. This is a fairly standard deployment. Now, the reason why I like this deployment is 99% of your army, the vast majority of it, is in cover and will not be able to be targeted turn 1. And if apart from this unit of conscripts out at the front, this is, and I'm sorry to say it, lads, but this is the bait. Now, basically what happens is, when you're running a fairly large hybrid guard army like this, there is a good chance that you are going to run out of space to hide every single unit. Maybe you could cram them in there, maybe, but you're going to get to the point where you're cramming stuff and it's starting to screw you over a little bit. At that point, do not be afraid to chuck out one of the remaining units of infantry you've got out front, and conscripts are really good for this as bait. Now, the reason why you want to do that is because a lot of enemies, even when they know that it's probably going to screw them over, really struggle to resist gunning down a big block of conscripts. It just feels good, and they're going to feel great clearing the whole space. They're like, yeah, I've killed so many of the guard, that's fantastic. But if they do that, then typically what they're doing is exposing themselves. Now, there are armies that can fire and fade and all that kind of good stuff, but a lot of that's been nerfed now to like once per game or once per turn, all this kind of crazy shit. I think it's once per game even. And so what you find is that people are going to come rushing out here. They're going to start gunning things down, and then before they realise it, now they're stuck out in the open. So this is a fairly standard deployment. This is against an army like, you know, maybe Marines who've got a bit of shooting, a bit of combat, and you can see there's a few elements going on here. I've got my fire support safely screened. There's always infantry or sacrificial vehicles on the front line. Look, where are my heavy hitters? They are protected. Where is my screen? It's at the front here. And so this is the kind of deployment you can expect when you're facing something like Marines or some other kind of generic take-all commerce force. This is what you can expect. This is also a fairly good deployment if you're facing off against a shooting arm that requires direct line of sight as well. Although what I would say is, if you're facing a shooting army, it's, you know, really try and get, and you know you're not going to get charged turn 1, really try and cram some of these guys into cover. And the reason you're going to want to cram these guys into cover is because then if you're getting shot at least some of them might get a save if you've got a cover save on there as well. So that's what I would call my fairly standard deployment, plus it's kind of close to my shooting deployment. Bear in mind, guys, this is kind of a rough approximation. There's always going to be different factors, different tables, different terrain. There's always going to be different factors that you will need to take into account, and you will need to tweak this. This is to give you a rough indication of how I deploy and what goes through my head and why I deploy this way. What do you see, guys? Or what should I say, what don't you see? I don't have my Leman Russes out on the front leading the charge. It might look cool, but it is wrong. You will get them killed very, very quickly. You need your tanks to do the heavy lifting. Even with Hammer of the Emperor, even with conscripts, even with all lasguns melting things, you still need your heavy hitters to pound the enemy into dust. So always have your sacrificial units up front. Your sentinel sacrificial. Now, if I was being a little bit more clever, guys, I'd leave a little bit of room for that sentinel to come through there. And that would probably be it, because then if I got turn 1 and I was facing Grey Knights, I'd start doing my scout moves out here, push the enemy back, all that kind of good stuff. That's why the sentinels are on the front line. They are on the front line because they're able to do a bit of scout moving and all that kind of good stuff. Now, bear in mind, one thing to mention, if you're not facing Grey Knights, and in this army, look, there's a lot of points here for no prison, for bring it down. What, max points? You don't want to give them any max points. What you would do if you were facing a shooting army that had taken bring it down, we talked about countering enemy secondaries, right? You would actually very much make sure that these sentinels were almost like backlined, like back here, or really tucked into cover, that no one was going to be able to get near them for the majority of the game, because all those sentinels are going to be doing in that kind of matchup is just not losing you points. Okay, this is kind of why I'm not a big fan of tax units, because there'll be some games where they can't contribute. But I guess nowadays, you know, your sentinels are going to be having las cannons and stuff, because they're, you know, 40 points all in now, aren't they? So that has changed somewhat. But I would still say, even if you've got sentinels and las cannons, If your opponent isn't likely to charge you or deep strike you and get you, keep them back, keep them hidden, and has them as a last ditch bit of firepower if you absolutely need it. So that's just one other thing to mention if you're facing a shooting army. Now, this is my sort of stand deployment. If I was facing a shooting army and I had the ability to hide everything out of line of sight, and I knew it wasn't going to cause me to get charged and wrapped and trapped and stuff turn one, all of these guys, let's say this ruin extends across here or something crazy, or there's a big bit of dents here or something, I don't know. If I could hide all of these guys, I would do. This is kind of like, right, I can't hide them, I might as well use them to bait them. Don't forget, you can actually draw your opponent out and then screw his plans over, because conscripts can have things like take cover put on them, they can have KD stands put on them, which makes them actually really, really durable. If you can imagine you've got a unit of conscripts that are maybe in a little bit of cover here, so they're on a 4-up save, then you put take cover on them on a 3-up save, then you put KD stands on them on a 2-up save, and they only get wounded on 3s or better. And then maybe it's even a dense bit of terrain so the mouse want to hit. That's a really durable squad of conscripts. So sometimes the bait can actually survive, which is if that happens, that's really, really good for you, because your opponent has literally come out and exposed itself for pretty much no benefit whatsoever. Now, if we're playing an assault army, things change quite a bit. There's 2 ways of dealing with an assault army. We'll show you those in a moment. Now here you can see my deployment if I'm going to be facing off against an assault style army, a really fast assault army. You see, there are a number of factions in 40k that are going to pretty much get a turn 1 charge against you if they want to. And so in that kind of situation, you have to be able to choose what you want to get charged. And that's kind of the key to this deployment. Now as you can see, it's a little bit different to my last one. It's similar, we've still got the firepower in the back, we don't want that getting tagged or wrapped and trapped or anything like that, but we've got a lot more infantry exposed at the front here. Now, because I know my opponent is a mostly assault army with only a scattering bit of firepower, I've decided, rather than trying to hug the cover as much as possible, I've made a really effective screen. Because if I'm going to get charged turn 1, and there's pretty much nothing I can do about that, then I might as well make the enemy charge what I want them to. And this is where conscripts are really, really good, because they can cover a huge amount of the board. In fact, if you look here, we've got 2 squads of conscripts which are able to cover pretty much my entire deployment zone, and there's some change. In some areas they're 3 ranks deep, not even 2 ranks deep the whole way along. And then behind that, in case that conscript screen is compromised, we've got our secondary screen, and that's made up of some more infantry squads here. So these screening units are what are going to allow me to keep my big guns safe against the enemy assaulters. We don't want the enemy to be able to get to our tanks. Now, we could deploy these tanks really far back. I mean, that would be sensible, right? Well, yes and no. When you're facing a more close combat opponent, one which is almost all in on the whole close combat, then you don't need to worry about protecting your tanks as much. And in fact, you might want to have them having turn 1 fields of fire. Now, why would you do that? Well, if you're playing a regiment like Cadium, you don't want to have to move. You want to have maximum firepower. You want to get those reroll ones for staying still straight away. So that's why you'd set up these fields of fire. And that's why these tanks are all exposed now. Because I'm pretty confident that my Russes will be able to take whatever supporting fire that the assault army has. I don't need to worry about hiding them as much. We're not facing an enemy shooting army now. So they're out, they're proud, and they're ready. No matter where my opponent charges, if he comes over here, if he comes over here, if he comes over here, hell, if he tries a little flanking maneuver, no matter where he comes, there's always 2 Russes. There's always firepower that can draw line of sight to him. So, and you'll notice another key thing here. There's 2 other sort of areas that you need to be aware of for this kind of deployment. I've got my sentinels further back here. Now, why have I done that? Well, if I'm facing a turn 1 assault army, we're not talking a deep striking army here, we're talking a turn 1 assault army, then I do not want my sentinels at the front, because one of the Achilles heels of sentinels is the fact that they could be tri-pointed really easily. And when I say tri-pointed, you've got, let's say the sentinel goes up here, right? And you've scout moved him forward. If the enemy charges him, it's not that hard for them to wrap and trap that sentinel of just a few units. And when that happens, that sentinel now can't get out, and your opponent can charge up, get close, not worry about return fire because the sentinel can't break out, and then he can get into your lines and do bad things to you, which is really, really bad. Now you might say, oh, Mordian Glory, you could just desperate breakout. Yeah, you could. But we're in a new world now, boys. CP isn't as common, so Desert Breakout is 2 CP. You might not necessarily want to do it. And don't forget, if you've pushed up with more than one sentinel and they've all got wrapped and trapped, well, that's not good at all. You're going to find the enemy encroaching on your lines and you're not even able to use your main asset, firepower, to fight him off. So if you're facing a fast assault army, be aware, you don't want your sentinels to lead to the enemy being able to move up the board unmolested. You need to be able to have your fire lanes, your killing fields, your overlapping fields of fire ready to rock and roll. However, if you're facing an assault army like Grey Knights or Thousand Suns that have got a bit of shooting, bit of assault, then what you might want to do is deploy your scout sentinels up front. So the opposite if you're facing a more ground-based assault army. What you can do then is you can scout move these sentinels out. And by scout moving them out, basically what you're doing is you're creating a huge buffer zone for your infantry. Now, if your opponent wants to try and get near your lines, you know, you would carefully, you'd probably bring this one over here a little bit. That's 9 inches from there, so you can't deep strike in there. There's an 18-inch gap there. That's really important, right? Why is 18 inches so important? Because you can't deep strike 9 inches from that sentinel, and he can't deep strike 9 inches from that sentinel, which means that whole area is a dead zone. He can't get in there. He's going to have to deploy over there. Great. Or I should say turn 1 deep strike over there. Likewise here, you've got an 18-inch gap here, and then a 9-inch gap here. Guess what? That whole, all this that you see before you, this big open space, that is safe from getting turn 1 deep strikes from some teleporters. And what you tend to find with certain factions like Grey Knights is that once you've taken away their turn 1 teleportation from them, their whole game plan, their whole way of thinking, right, this is what I was going to do, gets thrown out the window, and suddenly they're having to adapt on the fly, whereas you've got a plan that you can stick to. So now they're reacting to you, which is great. You are in the position of priority, you're in the position of command, and you are dictating the flow of the game. So that's why I love Scout Sentinels. And the fact that they've now come with like free good firepower means that not only can you do this kind of stuff with them, but if you're playing a game where you don't want to do that, they're no longer just a tax unit with multi-lasers. Now they've got firepower that can sit back and shoot and help, which is really, really good. Now, another point that I want to raise, which you've noticed in pretty much every single one of these deployments, is I've kind of kept these 20 infantry back. I've had other infantry which has been up front or strung out or been a screen or bait or whatever, but I've always had about 20 infantry that I've kept back. This is what I call my reserve. Now, we're not talking about strategic reserves here or deep strike or anything like that. This is just the term that I use for it. This is my active reserve. Now, what I like to do is I like to keep 20 infantry back. Sometimes if I'm using a lot more conscripts, I'll keep a whole blob of like 30 conscripts back. And what I do with that reserve of infantry, it's always like 20 to 30 guys, is I keep that as my extra screen, as my extra late game objective snatch and grabbers. What's really good about these guys is basically, you can imagine, let's say the enemy gets a turn 1 assault off and they clear all the conscripts. And then they might have shot some of these of the second screen down as well. So suddenly your line's looking really, really thin. Well, now you can deploy your active reserve and you can bring these infantry squads out here, plug holes in the lines, and now you've got a full screen again, which gives you another turn for the big guns to do their thing. And by turn, especially with a lot of assault armies, by turn 2, if you've been able to hold them off, the game starts quickly swinging and significantly swinging back in your favour. So that's why I always like to have this little active reserve of 2 infantry squads or 30 conscripts. I cannot tell you guys the number of games where it's been neck and neck, and then I've been able to deploy these guys turn 3 or turn 4 and my opponent's gone, oh my god, I didn't realise you had another 20 infantry. Right, yeah, you've won the game there, mate. GG. It's always good to have, if you've got the infantry to spare, it's always good to have the active reserve. It allows you to be more flexible. Sometimes you'll need it as just an extra bit of firepower. Sometimes you'll need it to move on to an objective that the enemy thought they had secured. Sometimes you'll need it to just hold the line. But it's really nice to have a little active reserve. That's a little sort of deployment trick that I've learned in some of my more recent tournaments. So another trick that I want to show you guys is, how do you work out if the enemy is going to be able to get a turn 1 charge and you or not? Well, firstly, you want to look at their army. You want to look at things that are like fast movers, like typically like bikes or jetpack troopers, and you ask your opponent, right, how far can that unit move? And he'll be like, okay, that'll move 14 inches. And you go, okay, so it can move 14 inches, and then does it get +1 to charge? Does it get anything like this? Can it advance and charge? All this kind of stuff. Ask him these kind of questions. What you're trying to work out is the maximum threat range of the enemy assaulting unit, okay? And so, for example, if you've got something like a Custodes Biker who moves 14 inches and then can charge a max of 12 inches, that's a 26-inch threat range. So you've got to try and work out depending on the deployment type, if my opponent's got a 26 in threat range, can he get a turn 1 charge on me? So I've got a tape measure here that's measured out to 26. And you can see, right, look, you can see pretty much no matter where I go, even when I've tried to deploy, I've not deployed my conscripts all the way back, but when I've deployed as much of my stuff as far back as possible, my opponent, if he chooses to, will get a turn 1 charge. Especially if you've got some ruins in the middle here, he can easily deploy his bikes behind those ruins. I won't be able to see him, and then able to get a turn 1 charge on me. When you see a situation like that, that is when you're like, okay, I can't really avoid the turn 1 charge at this point. I need to have my units pushed out on the line, and so that when those bikers come flying in, they're gonna kill a bunch of conscripts, but then my own units can move out and counterattack. So that's how you determine. And I have literally taken, I take 3 tape measures to a tournament with me, right? And I have literally done what you see here. I've got them out, I've clipped them into place, and I've literally laid them down in like 3 lines across the board and been like, okay, what is the maximum threat range? What's the bubble of my opponent? Now you've got to be careful you don't cede too much ground, but if you know that your army is built to take the game back turn 3, turn 4, turn 5, then that's great. And what typically happens if your opponent sees you doing that is you deploy a few units where he sees you're deploying far back. Your opponent will more than likely start deploying his units far back as well. Now why would he do that? Because if he sees that you're deploying further back, he's like, well, I'm not going to get my turn 1 charge. I don't want to line all my bikes up here only to then get, lose turn 1 and get shot off the board. So he'll start deploying his stuff further back. When you see him doing that, and he's deployed all his fast movers back there, what that then allows you to do is be a bit more aggressive and be like, right, actually, and now I know you're not going to get a turn 1 charge on me, even though you could have done, because you see me deploying further back, the advantage of having lots of small squads, guys, as we described at the beginning, then you can be like, right, now I'm actually not going to cede too much territory, and I've got my extra line of infantry up here. But these guys are still sacrificial. I don't really care about them. It's just because he might still have some redeploy shenanigans or something like that. So just something to be aware of, guys. Now, if you're facing an army with fly, don't forget, now I haven't bothered here, but if you're facing an army with fly, don't forget, you don't want to be leaving gaps like this, because he'll not only will he come over here, he'll then fly over the back, he'll have space to land his bases, and then he'll be able to get even further into your lines, and you're really going to find yourself trapped in deployment zone. And that's what I've got to show you here. Look at this fucking parking lot, boys. If you're not careful, you will get trapped in your deployment zone. So it's important to find that fine balance between screening the enemy out, protecting your own assets, but not cramming yourself so far back that you spend the whole game here and you don't get the opportunity to push out, take objectives, and hold ground. Because in the day, boys, you need to be taking objectives. So it's important. That's the factor you want to take in your deployment. But there's lots and lots of nuances when it comes to deployment. I've not even looked at all the different deployment types. We've been focusing on corner deployment because you tend to find, if you look at a lot of the missions that people include in their tournament packs these days, if you're going to a 1 day event, you'll probably find 2 out of 3 of the missions will be like this. You'll be in your table quarter deployment. If you go to a 2 day event, you'll probably find that 3 out of the 5 games are like this. Now, if you're playing like a Dawn of War style deployment, it's still very, very similar to being, this kind of deployment here, going from this end to here. It's very so similar, guys. You see, you've got your 3 ruins, right? You put some tanks behind here, you put some tanks behind here, you put some tanks behind here, you screen them off with infantry, you screen them off with infantry, you screen them off with infantry. It's a very, very similar scenario, guys. And likewise, if you're doing a different kind of diagonal where your deployment zone comes up to here and here, again, it's very similar concept, guys. You're screening with infantry out here, having your heavy hitters further back. So that is how you typically deploy your, what I would say, standard Imperial Guard army. Now, there's loads of nuances for this. We've got mechanized forces, we've got pure armored forces. There's loads of different styles of guard. It's kind of funny me saying a typical guard army when no 2 guard armies are alike. But what I would say, guys, is if you're a mech player and you've got double heavy flamer chimeras, see these conscripts as double heavy flamer chimeras. You're making that line, you're making that screen. Again, if you're a pure armoured player, you might be like, right, I've got some triple heavy flame demolishers. Those are your screening units. Those are your bruiser tanks. They're the ones that go up the front. So these conscripts are just there to represent a screening unit. But how your own list might vary, you need to take that into account. What are you going to be screening with? And if you say, well, I've got nothing I want to screen with, then that's a problem. You need to go back to the drawing board. You need to be thinking about your list there, because you need to be able to have units you're willing to sacrifice. Even if it's like, well, I've only got 10 lean Russes. Well, which of those lean Russes are you willing to push up the board, draw fire, sacrifice, so that the other ones can get firepower onto the enemy? That's what you need to be thinking like. This is the Guards, son. You know, we die standing. So I hope you guys have found that video useful, and that's basically my quick overview of how to get started with your deployment and what the kind of things you need to be thinking about when you are deploying your Imperial Guard army. So I hope you've enjoyed today's video, guys. If you have, please consider giving it a like and a subscribe and all that good stuff. Any extra interactivity really helps boost the video in the old YouTube algorithm. And if you've really enjoyed today's video, you want to go the extra mile when it comes to supporting the Mordian Glory channel, then please consider becoming a channel member or Patreon supporter. It is thanks to the channel members and the Patreons that I'm able to do Mordian Glory full time now, which is absolutely fantastic. Never thought I'd get here, guys, but the support I've had from this community has been incredible. I want to say a massive thank you and a shout out to our latest channel members and Patreon supporters. So I want to say a huge thank you to Panzerkampfwagen Baneblade, Castellan, Strike F3, Justin Hoji, Neo Cosmopolis, Eric McCombs, Dwarf Hammer, Caligula, Ryan Hancock and Silent Warrior for being channel members. Thank you guys for signing up and doing your part. I also want to give a shout out to our latest Patreons as well. So thank you to Alex Stengal, Gankistani, Ben Thorne, Alon Harfin, Marcus Roberts, Tim de Jägermeister and Jesse Cashman. Thank you all of you for signing up to the channel Patreon. It's absolutely incredible. Thank you guys. I also want to take a moment to say a personal, heartfelt thank you to all of my top tier Patreon supporters. These are the people that have really gone above and beyond the call of duty when it comes to supporting me, and I'm honestly just really grateful to every single one of them. So massive thank you to August Varney, Alex Stengel, John Stubbs, Nicholas Walsh and Swordfish Trombone for supporting me at the Lord General level. The top tier of Patreon support. You guys, it's amazing. Thank you. I also want to give a special shout out to my commissars as well. My other people who have signed up to another really high level of Patreon support. So massive thank you to Diesel Fox, Shooter McGavin, Tom Sutton and Ross Miller. Thank you guys. I really appreciate all the support that you've given me. It's amazing. So thank you to everyone that supports the channel. I hope you've all really enjoyed today's video. And of course, as always, I'll see you guys next time.